weight of a courtroom is not just in its walls, but in the silence it demands. The air inside the federal courtroom was unusually heavy that morning. A tall window let in a slant of pale light, dust motes floating in its path, as though time itself had slowed, the hum of shuffling papers, the muted click of a pen, the hushed whispers among attorneys. Every small sound seemed amplified in the stillness. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Leon, a man known less for theatrics and more for his deliberate, measured approach to justice. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the room, with the kind of patience that could quiet even the most restless crowd. It wasn't the size of the case that made the atmosphere tense, but the feeling that something unusual was about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett, standing at the counsel's table, exuded a calm intensity. She wasn't the tallest figure in the room, nor the loudest, but there was a gravity about her presence that commanded attention. She organized her notes with a steady hand. Though her eyes hinted at something deeper, resolve sharpened by experience, spectators filled the benches, some leaning forward with curiosity, others crossing their arms skeptically. Reporters tapped on small notepads, waiting for something worth writing. The case at hand wasn't just about facts and statutes. It was about perception, about whether the system could bend under pressure or stand firm against it. For a moment, no one spoke. The quiet was almost theatrical, as if the room itself knew it was holding its breath. Then the clerk's voice broke the silence, announcing the start of proceedings. Chairs shifted, all eyes moved toward the defense table. Judge Leon cleared his throat, his gaze settled on Jasmine. It wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. The kind of look that tested not just knowledge of the law, but the steadiness of the person delivering it. "Counselor," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "8, you may proceed." The room leaned in collectively. Jasmine stepped forward, her shoes echoed softly against the polished floor. She held no script, no overly rehearsed gestures. Instead, she let the pause stretch for a beat longer than expected, scanning the room as though inviting them to truly see her, not just hear her. What she said in the moments that followed would ripple far beyond that courtroom. But even before her words, there was a shift, a sense that something different was unfolding. This was not going to be a typical defense. This was going to be a moment. Judge Richard Leon had presided over countless cases in his career, yet his reputation rested not on fiery speeches or dramatic rulings, but on something rarer in a courtroom restraint. He was the kind of judge who let silence do the work, who let lawyers stretch their arguments until they either found their footing or collapsed under the weight of their own logic. His colleagues often described him as steady, a word that fit more comfortably than strict or lenient. Behind that steady demeanor, however, was a man who believed deeply in the gravity of his role. Justice wasn't a performance to him. It was a duty that outlived the individuals in the room. He carried himself with the awareness that his words could tilt lives, reputations, even history itself. Yet even with all his years of experience, there was something about Jasmine Crockett that struck him as different. She wasn't like the attorneys who entered his courtroom with too much confidence and too little preparation, nor like those who hid behind legal jargon to mask uncertainty. She was composed, but there was a fierceness behind her eyes. Jasmine's path to that moment had not been straightforward. Before entering the political spotlight, she had built her foundation in law, working cases that rarely made headlines, but shaped her resilience. She had learned early that being underestimated could be as much of an advantage as it was an obstacle. People who dismissed her often found themselves unprepared for the precision of her arguments, or the way she turned complexity into clarity. Colleagues described her as sharp, but those who knew her better understood that sharpness wasn't just intellectual. It was personal. Jasmine had faced rooms where her voice was tested, where her authority was doubted, and where her presence was second-guessed before she had even spoken. Over time, those experiences didn't harden her, but refined her. She carried them into every courtroom, not as burdens, but as proof that endurance itself could be a weapon. This case, whatever the legal specifics was, just another trial for her. It was an arena, a place where credibility and composure were on the line. On one side of the gallery sat skeptics, critics who believed Jasmine leaned too much on rhetoric, who expected her to falter under the direct questioning of Judge Leon. On the other side sat supporters who believed in her conviction, who whispered to one another that this was the moment she could shift perception in her favor. The spectators represented more than just curiosity. They mirrored the larger conflict at PL.I., the division between those who believed in the traditional cautious rhythm of the law and those who believed in challenging its conventions when it failed to reflect real life. Judge Leon, for his part, felt this tension even as he maintained composure. His eyes would occasionally flicker toward the gallery, sensing the expectations pressing on the walls. He knew his job was not to please one side or the other, but to draw out the truth as best as the law allowed. Yet truth had a strange way of bending when personalities like Jasmine Crockett entered the room. There was something undeniably human about the stakes. For Jasmine, this wasn't about personal pride. It was about what her defense would represent to others, watching to those who had been told to quiet their voices, to wait their turn to accept outcomes without protest. For Judge Leon, it was about preserving the dignity of the courtroom itself, ensuring that passion never drowned out principle. Each figure carried their own history, their own burdens into that chamber. Neither of them knew it yet, but the clash that was about to unfold would leave both the gallery and the court itself transformed. The clerk shuffled papers, attorneys whispered strategy. The low hum of tension threaded through the room. But the true story wasn't in the documents or the transcripts, it was in the people, and in Jasmine Crockett's steady inhale as she prepared to speak. The weight of both history and expectation pressed itself firmly onto the present moment. The first words from Jasmine Crockett did not rush. They came measured steady, as though she were building a bridge, one plank at a time. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful but unyielding. "This case is not just about interpreting the law as it stands on paper. It's about whether that law, as applied, honors the principles it was meant to uphold." Heads in the gallery tilted forward. People weren't here for routine legal arguments. They were here because they expected something more, a voice that could cut through the stiffness of the courtroom and bring urgency to the abstract. Judge Richard Leon leaned slightly back in his chair. His face revealed little, but his eyes, narrowed in concentration, tracked her carefully. He'd heard openings like this before, an attorney pushing to make the case larger than the statute, broader than the charge. The danger, he knew, was that rhetoric could overwhelm reasoning. "Counselor," he interrupted after a pause. "This courtroom is not a forum for political theater. Keep your remarks tied directly to the legal issue before us." The interruption was calm, almost casual, but its weight was unmistakable. Some in the gallery stiffened, as if bracing for conflict. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hands remained on the podium, fingertips grazing the surface like a pianist waiting for the next note. "With respect, Your Honor, the issue cannot be separated from the lives it affects. If the law ignores reality, then the courtroom becomes detached from justice." The room shifted. That was the first spark. Not anger, not disrespect, but challenge. Judge Leon's lips tightened into something between a frown and a smirk. He respected conviction, but conviction had to withstand scrutiny. He leaned forward, then, "Help me understand, Ms. Crockett," he said, his voice low but resonant. "If this law is as disconnected as you claim, point me to the precedent that supports your interpretation. Otherwise, we are not discussing law, we are discussing philosophy. And philosophy has no place here." There it was, the line in the sand. The test. Jasmine inhaled. This was the moment where many attorneys faltered when rhetoric collided with the judge's insistence on precision. But her voice did not waver. "The precedent, Your Honor, lies not in a single citation, but in a pattern in decisions where courts recognized that rigid application of the law created outcomes that defied fairness. If I may, I will cite several cases where judges stepped back and asked, does this ruling reflect justice or merely procedure? She began listing examples, her tone growing firmer with each one, not dramatized, not rushed, just steady, reasoned, unflinching. The gallery followed her rhythm the way a congregation might follow a sermon, each citation building on the last, until her argument began to take shape. Judge Leon raised a hand, halting her. "Enough." The word cut through the air. "Precedent is not about pattern, Ms. Crockett. It's about authority. We are bound by rulings, not by moods. You tread dangerously close to conflating one with the other." The silence that followed was heavy. Crockett's jaw tightened, but her expression remained composed. She knew what he was doing, testing her, pressing to see if her argument held more than surface conviction. Respectfully, "Your Honor," she replied, "the authority of precedent lies not just in its text, but in its reasoning. If the reasoning recognizes that blind adherence can harm, then that principle must guide us here. The law is not an island, it's a mirror, and if that mirror reflects injustice, then it fails its own purpose." The gallery stirred, a few murmurs rippled before the bailiff called for order. Judge Leon's gaze held on Jasmine. For the first time that morning, his expression revealed something, not approval, not disapproval, but curiosity. He was not used to being met with that kind of poise under pressure. Many attorneys, when confronted, folded into apologies or retreated into safe language. Jasmine did neither. She stood her ground without aggression, her words weaving conviction with restraint. Still, he had to press Ms. Crockett, he said. You speak as though the law must bend to your interpretation of justice. Tell me what prevents that from becoming chaos. What prevents every attorney from reshaping law to fit their ideals? That was the heart of the clash. It was not about statutes, not about citations, but about what anchored justice itself. Jasmine's reply came without hesitation. What prevents chaos? Your Honor, is integrity. Integrity of the argument, integrity of the evidence, and integrity of those entrusted to uphold it. If every attorney stood here making hollow appeals to ideals, the courtroom would collapse. But when the law as written collides with the truth of lived experience, we cannot ignore that collision. To do so would be to pretend the cracks don't exist. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Judge Leon leaned back again, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. The first clash was not over in any decisive sense, but the energy in the room had shifted. The gallery felt it, the attorneys felt it. Even the court staff, usually immune to tension, seemed caught in the current. The lines were drawn, neither had raised their voice, neither had resorted to insult or bluster. Yet the weight of the exchange reverberated like the first roll of distant thunder. And beneath that quiet thunder lay the unspoken question. Which force would carry more weight in this courtroom? The rigid letter of the law or the human urgency of justice? The courtroom air had barely settled when Jasmine made a choice. She knew statutes and citations could only take her so far. What lingered in the room wasn't just the law. It was the question of what the law meant for people whose names would never appear in a headline. So, she told a story, Your Honor, she began softly, her voice lowering, as though inviting the room closer. If I may, I want to explain why this case matters beyond these walls. Because for one woman, I met the law, became less of a shield and more of a weight she could not carry. The gallery hushed. This wasn't a standard legal tactic. It was risky. Personal narratives often strayed into what judges dismissed as irrelevant, but there was something in her tone, quaint but steady, that demanded attention. She was a mother of two. Jasmine continued. She worked double shifts at a nursing facility, trying to keep food on the table. When she ran into legal trouble, she believed the law would protect her if she told the truth, but what she found instead was a process so rigid, so mechanical, that her truth barely had a place. She wasn't judged for her actions. She was judged for failing to fit the mold that the statute expected. A man in the second row leaned forward, his hands clasped. Even Judge Leon's fingers, which had been drumming faintly on his chair, stilled. What struck me most, Jasmine went on, was not her fear of punishment, but her disbelief. She told me, I thought the law was supposed to see me, but all it saw was a mistake I couldn't undo. The room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Leon shifted slightly, his face unreadable, but his silence was permission enough for her to continue. This woman's story is not an isolated tragedy, Jasmine said. It reflects what happens when the law becomes detached from the very people it claims to serve. And when we detach, we create not justice, but distance. That distance is where trust in the system begins to crumble. She paused, letting the words land. Then more softly, and trust once lost is harder to restore than any broken statute. For a moment, the room wasn't a courtroom. It was a gathering of people, bearing witness to one woman's quiet fight against a system too large to bend for her. Judge. Leon finally spoke, his voice lower, almost reflective. You are aware, Ms. Crockett, that anecdotal testimony does not change the letter of the law. Yes, Your Honor, Jasmine replied, but it reveals the cost of how that law is applied. And if we ignore the cost, we risk enforcing rules that no longer reflect the values they were meant to uphold. It wasn't defiance. It was something closer to pleading, not for herself, not even for the case, but for recognition that behind every statute lay a story, too fragile to be ignored. The gallery seemed moved in subtle ways. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man shifted uncomfortably as though wrestling with his own experiences. And in that silence, Jasmine leaned on the podium, her gaze steady. What do we want our courts to be remembered for? For following the letter so rigidly that people disappear inside it? Or for recognizing when the letter falls short of justice itself? That question was not an argument in the legal sense. It was a mirror held up to the judge, to the audience, to the very institution that gave the room its power. And though no ruling was handed down that day, Something more subtle had happened. The gallery, once restless with anticipation of sparks and spectacle, now sat with a different awareness that the law's true weight was not in the drama of the clash, but in the quiet, unseen lives it shaped. The courtroom had grown so still that the faint hum of the overhead lights became noticeable. Every eye remained fixed on Jasmine, and even Judge Richard Leon, known for his stern demeanor, appeared caught in thought. Jasmine took a breath, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "Your Honor," she said, "I know the law is written in ink, not in breath. But laws don't enforce themselves. People do. And that means every decision here isn't just about what's written. It's about what it says to those watching, those living under its reach." The words carried weight, and for the first time Judge Leon leaned forward, his voice sharper now, more pointed. "Are you suggesting, Ms. Crockett, that this court abandoned precedent simply because the law feels unfair in certain instances?" There it was, the question everyone had been waiting for, the line in the sand. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch before answering. "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that precedent cannot be an excuse for blindness. If the law has become a shield against responsibility rather than a tool for justice, then precedent must be questioned." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others stiffened at what they saw as audacity. Judge Leon narrowed his eyes. "And where would you have this court draw the line? If every law is up for reinterpretation at the whim of moral argument, what then protects us from chaos?" It was a fair question, one that revealed not just his authority, but his unease. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone. Her voice did not rise, but it gained a firmness that pressed against the silence. The line, "Your Honor," must be drawn at humanity. If the law cannot serve the people it governs, then it ceases to be law in the truest sense. It becomes ritual, and rituals without meaning do not protect, they oppress. The words struck with unusual force. For a moment it wasn't a courtroom exchange. It was a confrontation between two visions of justice, one rooted in structure, the other in lived truth. Judge Leon tilted his head, studying her. His reply came slower this time. "You are asking this court to weigh compassion against consistency. Do you realize the gravity of that?" "Yes," Jasmine said, "because consistency without compassion is simply machinery. Machinery may run smoothly, but it does not care who is crushed beneath its gears." The gallery reacted audibly now. A few gasps, a hushed whisper. The bailiff shot a glance toward the back row, ready to restore order if needed. But even he seemed reluctant to cut the tension that hung in the air. This was the moment, the turning point. Judge Leon's hand hovered over his notes, but he didn't look down. His eyes remained on Jasmine. Finally, he asked the question that cut deeper than any legal technicality. "Tell me, Ms. Crockett, are you arguing for this case, or are you arguing for the very definition of justice itself?" The room froze. Even those who had entered casually expecting little more than routine legal drama now leaned in. This wasn't just about statutes anymore. It was about the soul of the system itself. Jasmine's reply came like a steady flame. "Your Honor, I am arguing that justice is not a destination written in our books. It is a responsibility carried in our choices. And if this courtroom cannot recognize that responsibility, then who will?" Her words didn't end the debate, but they shifted it. For the first time, Judge Leon looked less like a man protecting precedent and more like a man grappling with the weight of what precedent could cost. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged alive with the awareness that something had cracked open, not resolved, not settled, but exposed. The audience felt it. They hadn't come for philosophy, but they left realizing they'd witnessed it unfold in real time. A courtroom, not just as a chamber of law, but as a stage for the hardest question of all. What do we do when the rules we live by no longer reflect the lives we are living? The air inside the courtroom felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but quieter, as if everyone present understood they had just crossed a threshold. The clash had passed, but the echoes of it still lingered in every corner of the room. Judge Richard Leon sat back in his chair, his pen no longer scribbling across his notes. For once he didn't seem eager to respond. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, as though he needed the space to breathe in what had just been said. Jasmine, too, stood still. She didn't press further, didn't try to force the moment into a victory. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about what had been revealed. Finally, Judge Leon broke the quiet. His voice was measured, softer than before. "You've given this court much to consider, Ms. Crockett, I cannot promise your words will change the outcome, but I will not pretend they did not reach me. It wasn't concession, it wasn't defeat. But it was acknowledgement, and in a place as rigid as a federal courtroom, acknowledgement can feel monumental. A low hum of whispers moved through the audience, people processing what they had just witnessed. Some looked unsettled, others strangely hopeful, and though no verdict had yet been delivered, the trial had already done something rare. It had pulled the idea of justice out from the pages of law books and placed it raw and alive in front of everyone watching. Jasmine returned to her seat, her shoulders relaxing only slightly. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, as if she knew the weight of what had been spoken would continue to hang in the air long after the gavel fell. For Judge Leon, the moment seemed to linger even more heavily. He glanced down at his notes, then closed the folder altogether. There are times when the written record feels inadequate, when the neat lines of precedent cannot hold the depth of what has just unfolded. This was one of those times. In that stillness, the courtroom became less about walls and rules and more about the people inside it. People searching for answers in a world where answers rarely come clean. One observer later described the moment like this. It wasn't about whether one side won or lost. It was about remembering that justice is not a statue we worship. It's a living thing, fragile enough to slip through our fingers if we forget to hold it carefully. The gallery eventually emptied, footsteps echoing down the marble halls. But those who had been there carried something with them. A story they would tell in their own words. Some would say Jasmine Crockett stood fearless before power. Others would say Judge Leon revealed that even the sternest gavel can pause when confronted with truth. Both were right. By the time the courthouse doors closed, one fact had become clear. This was not just a legal battle. It was a moment of reflection. A reminder that even in places designed to decide outcomes, there are times when the real verdict is the one we render in ourselves. And maybe that's why the silence at the end felt so heavy. Not because it was empty, but because it was full of questions, of doubts, of hope. Judge Leon didn't settle the matter that day. He couldn't. No single ruling ever truly does. But what he did leave the courtroom with was an awareness that perhaps justice is not defined by how tightly we guard precedent, but by how deeply we are willing to listen. And Jasmine's words, steady, unshaken, deeply human, had reminded everyone of that truth. Long after the courtroom lights dimmed and the doors were locked, the story of that day lived on in quiet conversations, in thoughtful pauses, in the way people carried themselves when they spoke of justice. What made it memorable wasn't a final ruling, or even the sharp words exchanged. It was the silence afterward, that rare silence, where everyone, no matter their position, felt the weight of something larger than procedure. Justice Leon and Jasmine Crockett stood on opposite ends of an argument, yet both revealed something essential, that the pursuit of truth is never simple, and the human spirit often finds its sharpest edge when tested by doubt. In that stillness, one question lingered. When the gavel falls, do we measure justice by the verdict or by the courage it took to speak? When silence was easier, the answer isn't written in statutes or tucked inside casebooks. It's written in us, in the choices we make when confronted with moments that demand more than compliance. Perhaps that is why this moment stayed with so many. Because it reminded us that justice is not only about what is decided in courtrooms. It's about how deeply we listen, how bravely we speak, and how honestly we reflect on what those moments mean. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of verdict that never fades.